These three disturbing Alaskan horror stories are inspired by real events on fishing boats. First, a crew is sealed in the freezing dark by a captain who has quietly lost his mind. Next, a survivor is pulled from the waves, only to scream about a horror no one else can see. And finally, a captain's reckless greed turns a steel vessel into a ticking time bomb. But make sure you watch until the very end, because you need to hear the heartbreaking calculation one man made when he realized his life had been traded to save a few dollars. The Bering Sea does not care if you live or die. That is the first thing you learn when you sign a contract for the winter king crab season. The ocean is a black, freezing void that wants to pull you under, and the ice fog is a gray curtain that tries to hide the horizon until you forget what land looks like. But every crab fisherman knows that the biggest gamble isn't the weather. It isn't the waves that rise like mountains in the dark. The biggest risk you take is with the man standing in the wheelhouse. You trust the captain with your life because you have to. You believe that while you work the deck, battered by wind and spray, he is the one holding the map. He is the one who knows the way home. But what happens when the map in his head changes? What happens when the man guiding the ship gets lost in his own mind? In January of 2018, the crew of the FV Pacific Harvester found out. They were 85 miles south of St. Paul Island, deep in the crabbing grounds. It was the definition of isolation. For the first 2 weeks, the rhythm was brutal but predictable. 17 days straight, 20 hours a day. The crew moved like machines, fueled by coffee and the promise of a massive payout. The fatigue on a crab boat is a physical weight, a pressure that sits behind your eyes and makes the world blur at the edges. But through the exhaustion, there was always one constant: Captain Morrison. Morrison was a legend in the fleet, 30 years on the water, a man who could smell a storm before the barometer dropped. He was the authority, the veteran, the safety net. But somewhere around the 15th day, the safety net began to fray. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden explosion. It started with the silence. Usually the wheelhouse is alive with chatter, updates on the catch, weather reports, banter between boats. But First Mate Leo noticed that the captain had turned the radio down. Then he turned it off completely. Too much noise, Morrison had muttered, staring out at the empty black ocean. Can't hear myself think. Then came the stillness. A captain usually paces, checks charts, monitors the deck, but Morrison began to just stand. He would grip the helm with white-knuckled intensity, his body rigid, staring at the radar screen for hours, not checking it, just watching the green sweep line go round and round, as if looking for a pattern that wasn't there. By day 17, the behavior shifted from odd to unsettling. The course corrections started, small, illogical adjustments. He would steer the massive FV Pacific Harvester 5 degrees west, then 10 degrees east, zigzagging through open water. When the engineer asked about it, Morrison didn't shout. He didn't get angry. He just whispered, "They're moving. The crabs are moving. Someone is telling them to move." The crew tried to rationalize it. "It's just the lack of sleep," they said. "It's the stress." They kept their heads down, focusing on the work, on the tangible reality of the steel pots and the freezing spray. They tried to stay out of the wheelhouse, avoiding the man who was slowly becoming a stranger. But the atmosphere on the boat had changed. The air felt thin, dangerous. It was the creeping dread of realizing that the person in charge was no longer reacting to the ocean, but to a reality only he could see. Then came the 18th day. The paranoia finally found a shape. Captain Morrison cornered Leo in the galley. The captain's eyes were rimmed with red, the pupils blown wide. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked wired, vibrating with a manic energy. "I know what's happening," Morrison said, his voice dry and clipped. "I checked the logs. The numbers don't add up." "What numbers, Cap?" Leo asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The crab," Morrison hissed, leaning in close. "You're stealing them. The crew. You're hiding the catch, stashing it to sell behind my back." It was an impossible accusation. There is nowhere to hide a king crab on a boat. They are massive creatures. But looking into Morrison's flat, empty eyes, Leo realized that logic no longer mattered. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a delusion that had hardened into fact. The crew walked on eggshells for the rest of the day. The wrongness on the ship was now a palpable thing, a heavy fog that followed them across the deck. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. At 11 p.m. it did. The sea outside was a restless mess of black waves. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the rumble of the engine room. It wasn't the whisper Leo had heard earlier. It was loud, distorted. He named 3 deckhands, Ben, Cody, and Mike. "Report to the fish hold," the voice commanded. "Immediately. Get down there and recount the catch. Find the missing crabs." The order was insane. The hold was a massive refrigerated tank filled with circulating seawater and 180,000 pounds of live crab. Recounting them at sea was impossible. It was dangerous. But on a ship, the chain of command is absolute. Disobeying a direct order in the middle of the Bering Sea isn't an option. The 3 men climbed down the steep aluminum ladder into the belly of the ship. The fish hold is a hostile world, built to keep crabs alive, not humans. The air was chilled to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The only light came from a single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling, swinging with the roll of the ship, casting long, nauseating shadows against the wet steel walls. The smell was thick, brine and ammonia. The sound was a constant, unsettling background noise. The deep, rhythmic thumping of the engine against the hull, the sloshing of dark water, and over it all, the endless, wet clicking and skittering of thousands of hard shells moving over one another in the dark. Mike was standing near the heavy, watertight hatch when the sound happened. Clunk. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the waves. It was the distinct, heavy sound of steel hitting steel. The 3 men froze, looking up at the hatch above them. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Captain Morrison was manually driving the deadbolts home. There were 12 heavy steel bolts on that hatch. One by one, he locked them. It was the sound of a bank vault sealing shut. Then the intercom on the wall buzzed. The captain's voice filled the freezing room. It was calm now, terrifyingly calm. "You'll stay locked in until someone confesses," he said. "Until my money is returned. I know what you did. You have all the time in the world down there." The men were sealed in. The reality hit them like a physical blow. They were trapped inside a refrigerator, miles from civilization, under the command of a man whose mind had finally snapped. Panic is contagious. Mike scrambled toward the emergency radio mounted on the wall. He keyed the mic. "Mayday, mayday. Captain Morrison has locked us in. We are trapped." There was no static, no response. The line was dead. Morrison had cut the feed from the wheelhouse. The single light bulb above their heads flickered. Then it died. The hold plunged into absolute crushing darkness. The ventilation fans whined down and stopped. Morrison had cut the power. No lights, no fresh air, no heat. Now the cold began to bite. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was predatory. The temperature in the steel box dropped rapidly. The men huddled together in the black void, listening to their own terrified breathing and the wet, clicking movement of the crabs surrounding them. They banged on the hull until their hands bled. They screamed until their voices were raw. But no one came. Minutes stretched into hours, 1 hour, 2, 3. In the dark, your mind begins to turn on you. The cold seeped into their bones, slowing their hearts, thickening their thoughts. They stopped talking. They huddled in the dark, shivering violently, waiting for the end. They accepted that this was it. The captain had lost his mind, and he was going to let them freeze to death in the belly of his ship. Then, suddenly, a sound. Clunk, clunk, clunk. The bolts were retracting. The men looked up, blinded as the hatch screeched open. The harsh deck lights flooded the hold, stinging their eyes. A figure stood in the opening, silhouetted against the night sky. It was Captain Morrison. Mike, Ben, and Cody cowered, waiting for a weapon, waiting for the final act of violence. But Morrison didn't have a gun. He was holding a coffee mug. He leaned over the edge of the hatch, looking down at them with genuine confusion. His face wasn't angry. It wasn't manic. It was normal. "What the hell are you guys doing down there?" Morrison yelled, his voice annoyed but casual. "Stop messing around. We've got pots coming up in 10 minutes. Get back on deck." He turned and walked away. The three men stared at each other in the freezing light. The terror that washed over them in that moment was worse than the darkness, worse than the cold. He didn't know. He had locked them in a freezer for 3 hours. He had accused them of theft. He had cut the power. And now, he had simply forgotten. The psychosis had wiped the slate clean, resetting his reality as if the last 3 hours had never happened. They climbed out of the hold, their bodies shaking, their minds reeling. They didn't call the Coast Guard. They didn't mutiny. They were 85 miles from land in the middle of the ocean. They had no choice. They put their gear back on. They went back to the deck. They went back to work. For the next 4 days, they worked under the command of a man who had tried to kill them and didn't even remember it. They watched him in the wheelhouse, sipping his coffee, steering the ship, acting like the authority figure they had always trusted. But every time he looked down at the deck, every time he gave an order, the crew felt a sick knot in their stomachs. They survived the trip. They made it back to port, but none of them ever signed a contract with the FV Pacific Harvester again, because they know the truth now. The scariest thing isn't a captain who wants to hurt you. It's a captain who can lock you in the dark, leave you to die, and then ask you why you're late for work. When Deckhand Doyle was swept overboard by a rogue wave and pulled back onto the fishing vessel after 4 minutes in 39-degree water, the crew thought they'd saved his life. But as hypothermia set in, Doyle became convinced someone else was still drowning out there. And an hour later, he broke a window, climbed back onto the deck, and jumped into the black water again while everyone slept. You don't come to the Bering Sea in October for the view. You come because the money is good, and you think you're tough enough to handle the machine. In 2016, on a vessel 140 miles west of Dutch Harbor, a crew found out exactly how that machine works. Opilio crab season was in full swing. 45-knot winds were stripping the tops off the waves, turning the air into a sandblaster of freezing salt spray. Visibility was zero, just a wall of moving gray water that wanted to kill you. Captain Anders was up in the wheelhouse at 1:40 in the afternoon. On a boat, time is the only thing that makes sense. You live by the watch schedule. Down on the deck, the noise was absolute. Hydraulics screaming, steel pots banging against the rail, and the deep mechanical chugging of the engines running under the steel grating. Doyle was down there in the thick of it. 28 years old, strong as an ox, and smart enough to respect the gear. He wasn't some greenhorn making rookie mistakes. He was securing an 800-pound crab pot that had shifted in the stack. He was focused on the chain, wrenching it tight, his movements practiced and rhythmic. Just work. Just another shift in the grinder. Gravity, however, had other ideas. A rogue wave rose up off the stern quarter. It wasn't part of the regular set. It was a freak of nature, a vertical slab of water standing 30 feet taller than the rest of the swell. It looked less like water and more like a building falling over. It hit the vessel with the impact of a train collision. The steel hull groaned under the stress, pitching violently to the side. For 10 seconds, the world was nothing but white foam and freezing darkness. When the vessel finally shook off the water and leveled out, the deck was empty. The pot was there, the launcher was there, but Doyle was gone. "Man overboard!" The shout barely cut through the wind, but it was enough. Doyle was in the water. He was wearing a float coat, which kept his head above the surface. But he had no survival suit. He was exposed to 39-degree water. At that temperature, the ocean acts like a flash freezer. It hits the chest, punches the air out of the lungs, and sends the body into immediate shock. Blood pulls away from the arms and legs to protect the core. Nerves stop firing. Muscles turn to stone. Captain Anders didn't hesitate. He slammed the props into reverse, swinging the heavy stern around to create a lee, a temporary patch of calm water to work in. The crew on deck moved with the desperation of men who knew the math. 4 minutes. That's the deadline. After 4 minutes in that water without a suit, you aren't rescuing a man, you're recovering a body. They saw a flash of orange in the trough of a massive swell. Doyle. He was bobbing like a cork, thrashing in a way that didn't look right. He wasn't swimming. He was convulsing. A crewman threw the life ring. The wind tried to take it, but it landed close enough. Doyle managed to hook an arm through it, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The crew hauled him in. A waterlogged man in winter gear weighs a ton, but adrenaline does a lot of the lifting. They dragged him over the rail, and he hit the steel deck with a wet, heavy sound. He was shaking so violently, his boots were drumming against the metal. His lips were the color of a bruise, but he was coughing up salt water. He was alive. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. They dragged him straight into the galley. The air in there was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, stale coffee, and wet wool. They stripped him naked right on the linoleum floor. They rubbed his skin raw with rough towels to get the blood moving and buried him under a mountain of thermal blankets. They forced hot cocoa down his throat, watching his hands tremble so bad he spilled half of it. Relief washed over the room. They had beaten the house. They had cheated the Reaper. It was a win. Doyle sat on the bunk staring at the floor. He was quiet. The shaking subsided to a steady shiver, and the color crept back into his face. He looked like a man who just needed sleep. "He's still out there," Doyle whispered. The other men stopped talking. One of the deckhands leaned in close. "Who, Doyle? You're safe, buddy. We got you." Doyle didn't blink. He stared at a rivet on the wall. "The other guy. I saw him. He's still drowning." Hypothermia does strange things to the wiring in the brain. When the core temperature drops, reason shuts down. Delirium sets in. Men see things. They hear things. They believe in monsters and phantoms. "There's nobody else, Doyle," Captain Anders said, his voice firm but calm. "We did a head count. Everyone is on board. It's just the cold messing with you." Doyle started to get agitated. He tried to stand up, shedding the blankets. "I was in the water with him. I saw him sinking. He was reaching for me." Captain Anders looked at the situation. Doyle was exhausted, confused, and sick. He wasn't going to settle down if he was surrounded by the noise of the galley. "Let's get him to the spare stateroom," Anders said. "Lock him in. He needs to sleep it off. He's a danger to himself right now." It felt wrong to lock a crewmate up like a prisoner, but on the Bering Sea, safety comes before feelings. They guided a protesting Doyle down the narrow hallway and shoved him into the spare room. They slammed the heavy steel door. They turned the deadbolt. Click. He was contained. He was warm. He was safe. The boat continued to rock in the gale. The adrenaline dump hit the rest of the crew hard. It leaves you hollowed out, weak. Since the pots were secure and the weather was too rough to fish, most of the guys went to their bunks. The ship got quiet. The shouting stopped. The frantic energy died down. It was just the sound of the ocean slapping the hull and the wind whistling through the vents. The dust had settled. Everyone thought the crisis was over. An hour passed. Most of the crew was asleep, passed out from the stress of the rescue. The hallway was empty. Then came the sound. On a steel boat, you get used to the groans and the slams. But the sound of safety glass exploding is something you never get used to. It cracked through the quiet ship like a rifle shot. Captain Anders was out of his bunk and in the hallway in seconds. The other men stumbled out behind him, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The door to the spare stateroom was still locked tight. Anders fumbled with the master key. He threw the bolt and kicked the door wide. The room was empty. The porthole was gone. That glass is reinforced, designed to take a beating from green water and ice. Doyle had waited until the ship was quiet, until he knew no one was watching, and then he smashed it outward with his bare hands. There was blood on the jagged shards that remained in the frame. The crew ran to the rail, shining the high-powered sodium lights into the gray afternoon gloom. Doyle had stripped off his clothes. His thermal underwear lay in a pile on the floor of the stateroom. The coroner would later call it paradoxical undressing. It happens right at the end. The misfiring brain tells the freezing victim they are burning up, so they strip down to cool off. Naked, bleeding, and delirious, Doyle had squeezed through that broken window. He had walked across the ice-slicked steel deck on bare feet, and he had jumped. He went back into the freezing water. The crew searched for 6 hours. They burned diesel circling the spot, calling his name until their voices were raw. But the ocean is big, and the visibility was garbage. They never saw him again. The Coast Guard located Doyle's body 3 days later. The currents are predictable if you know the charts. He had drifted about 12 miles from where the vessel had been. The official report was tidy. It was logical. Cause of death: hypothermia. They wrote off the window and the jump as terminal burrowing, a final animal instinct where a dying brain seeks a small space or does something erratic to find safety. To the people on land, it was a tragedy, but a simple one. A brain broken by the cold, chasing a hallucination into the grave. That was the story the crew told themselves to sleep at night, until the Coast Guard called back a week later. It was a routine follow-up call. The officer on the line needed to close out the investigation and had a few questions about Doyle's mental state prior to the incident. He wanted to know if there were any signs of instability, any reason Doyle would voluntarily exit the vessel. Captain Anders told him the truth. He wasn't suicidal. He was delirious. The cold messed up his head. He kept screaming that there was another man out there drowning, and he had to go save him. The line went dead silent for a long moment. "Captain," the officer finally said, his voice dropping an octave, "you said he claimed he saw another man?" "Yeah," Anders said, his grip tightening on the radio mic. "Total hallucination. That's impossible, though. We were the only boat in that sector for 100 miles. There were no distress calls, no debris, nothing. Where could he have come from? There is no way anyone else was out there. Well, the officer said, that's the thing. When we recovered Mr. Doyle, he wasn't the only one we pulled out of that sector. The officer explained that during the sweep for Doyle, they had found a second body, an unidentified male wearing an old survival suit, floating about a half-mile south of where they found Doyle. He had been dead for weeks, just another ghost lost to the Bering Sea. The silence on the bridge of the vessel was absolute. Doyle hadn't been hallucinating. When he fell into that water the first time, down in the crushing dark, he must have bumped into something. He saw a face in the gloom, and when the crew pulled him out, he knew he had left someone behind. He didn't break out of that locked room because he was crazy. He didn't jump into the freezing ocean naked because he was sick. He went back because he was trying to be a hero. He sacrificed his life to save a stranger that only he could see. Science offered a comfortable explanation. It said it was just delirium. But the ocean doesn't care about science. Doyle saw the truth floating in the black water, and the crew locked him in a room until he died trying to prove it. The sea took 2 men that month, but it only had to kill one of them twice. Captain Moose ignored the winter storm warning to protect a $380,000 king crab haul, but as 340,000 pounds of ice silently built on one side through the night, the boat listed 2 degrees every hour, and the youngest deckhand, Dutch, found falsified Coast Guard reports proving the captain had been overloading the vessel for 3 years, risking all their lives for money. That is the short version. But to really understand the horror of February 2016, you have to understand the man. You have to understand the specific, suffocating weight of his greed. Out on the Bering Sea, 95 miles northwest of St. George Island, your captain is your god. He decides if you sleep, he decides if you eat, and he decides if you live. Moose was a man who looked at a safety regulation and saw a personal insult. He was the kind of guy who would use duct tape to patch a survival suit because a patch kit cost $20. To him, every dollar spent on safety was a dollar stolen from his pocket. It was the end of a 2-week season window. The air was sitting at 20 below zero. The water was 38 degrees. The tanks were full of king crab worth $380,000. That money was palpable in the air. You could almost taste it. Then the radio spit out the warning: severe freezing spray. In the wheelhouse, Dutch, the youngest deckhand, watched Moose's face. He saw the calculation happening behind the old man's eyes. It wasn't about safety. It was about diesel. "Skipper," Dutch said, his voice low, "that warning is serious. St. George is 3 hours out. We can drop the pots and run." Moose didn't look at the radar. He looked at the fuel gauge. He tapped the glass with a thick, calloused finger. "Run?" Moose scoffed, not taking his eyes off the fuel needle. "You know what it costs to run back to St. George and sit on the hook for 2 days? $5 grand in fuel, another $2 grand in lost fishing time. You want to pay that, Dutch? You want to take $7,000 out of the crew share because you're scared of a little ice?" "It's not the money, Skip," Dutch said. "It's the weight. We're already riding low." Moose turned then. He got close. The intimacy of his greed was in his breath, smelling of stale coffee and arrogance. "I've been running boats since before you were born. I know what this boat can take. We don't run from money. We keep fishing." He stayed on the throttle. He made the crew feel small for wanting to live, and that decision turned the ship into a ticking clock. The crew finished an exhausted 20-hour shift. They were too tired to argue anymore. They crawled into their bunks below deck and passed out. But while they slept, the ocean went to work. Freezing spray didn't land like snow. It hit the steel and turned into white concrete. It filled the gaps in the wire mesh of the crab pots stacked on deck. It coated the railings. And because the wind was hammering the boat from just one direction, the ice wasn't spreading out evenly. It was building a lopsided fortress on the starboard side. Hour by hour, the weight piled up. 340,000 pounds of ice. The ship began to list. It was a slow, creeping tilt. 2 degrees every hour. Down in the bunks, the men started shifting in their sleep. By 2 a.m., the list hit 8 degrees. On the main deck, the sound changed. The usual noise of the ocean was cut by a metallic grinding. Screech. It was the sound of the heavy steel crab pots, cemented with ice, sliding across the slanted deck plates. Dutch woke up because gravity felt wrong. He tried to stand up and stumbled into the bulkhead. He pulled on his boots and climbed the ladder to the wheelhouse. He found the wheelhouse empty. Moose had gone down to the galley. Dutch seized the moment. He didn't go to the radar. He went to the filing cabinet. He needed to know why the boat felt so heavy. He needed to see the history. He pulled out a folder marked Maintenance and Stability. He flipped past the fuel receipts, every gallon accounted for down to the penny, and found the Coast Guard correspondence. He read the letter from 3 years ago. Subject: Vessel Stability Retrofit. Requirement: sponson installation to increase beam width for heavy loads. Cost estimate: $50,000. There was a handwritten note in the margin in Moose's jagged scrawl. Denied, too expensive, waste of money. Dutch felt sick. 50 grand. That was the price. Moose had looked at a modification that would guarantee their safety, and he had decided it cost too much. Then Dutch found the logbook. He looked at the certified safe load rating, 200,000 pounds. Then he looked at Moose's entry for tonight, 420,000 pounds. You looking for something? Dutch spun around. Moose was standing in the doorway, a mug of coffee in his hand. The boat listed again, harder this time, forcing Moose to grab the door frame. Dutch held up the logbook. 420,000 pounds, Moose. The rating is 200. You're running double. You've been running double for 3 years. Moose stepped into the room. He snatched the book out of Dutch's hand. Those ratings are for lawyers and insurance agents. They don't know this boat. I know this boat. She handles the weight fine. She's listing 8 degrees, Dutch yelled, pointing at the inclinometer. She's not handling it. You saved 50 grand on the retrofit, and now you're going to kill us to save 5 grand on fuel. Is that the math? Is that what we're worth? Moose got right in his face. His eyes were hard. I sign the checks here. You worry about pulling pots. I worry about the boat. We need to turn around, Dutch said. Right now. Moose slammed the logbook onto the dash. Stay in your lane, Dutch. We aren't going anywhere. That was the moment. That was the sentence that killed them. We aren't going anywhere. As the words left his mouth, the ocean decided to answer. A massive swell hit the starboard side. Because Moose refused to turn into the weather, the wave caught the ice-heavy rail broadside. The boat lurched violently. The list didn't just increase, the floor dropped out. The angle went from 8 degrees to 32 degrees in seconds. Moose was thrown against the console. His coffee cup shattered. Dutch hit the wall. The noise was deafening. The chains on the deck snapped like gunshots. Pow, pow, pow. The crab pots broke loose, smashing into the starboard rail with the force of a freight train. The steel structure of the ship groaned, a deep, terrible sound of metal twisting apart. Water poured over the rail. It wasn't a splash, it was a river. Moose stared at the window, his eyes wide. The arrogance evaporated. He realized too late that physics doesn't care if you're the captain. Someone moved. A hand slammed onto the radio microphone. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! This is Captain Moose. We are capsizing. Position is 95 miles northwest of St. George Island. Request immediate assist." It was a scream. Fast, frantic, terrified. It was the sound of a man who knew the bill had finally come due. Down below, the lights died. Cliff, the engineer, was in the engine room. He was in pitch blackness, the floor tilted, freezing water rushing in. The smell of diesel fuel and brine filled the air. Cliff fought his way up, scrambling over pipes, muscles burning. He burst out onto the main deck just as the boat was rolling onto its side. The wind hit him like a hammer. He saw the survival suits mounted on the wall. Cliff stood there for a split second. He looked at the suits. Then he looked at the rising black water. He was an engineer. He lived by numbers. And in that second, he did the final calculation. To get that suit out, unroll it and zipper himself in. 2 minutes. Time before cold shock in 38-degree water locks your muscles and kills you. 90 seconds. 2 minutes to put on the suit. 90 seconds to live. Moose had saved money on the retrofit. He had saved money on the fuel. And when Dutch begged him to turn, he told him to stay in his lane. Now, he had left Cliff with a deficit of 30 seconds. Cliff didn't go for the suit. There wasn't time. He braced himself as the ocean rose up to meet him. He hit the water. He fought to keep his head up, but the cold was a physical blow. It sucked the heat right out of his core. He lasted exactly as long as the math said he would. 2 minutes. Then he was gone. The Captain Moose rolled completely over and sank. The air pockets inside the hull burst with massive, booming implosions. A life raft popped free. 4 men managed to swim to it. They hauled themselves in, soaked, freezing, shaking violently. They sat there in the dark, listening to the wind. 35 minutes later, the sound of rotors cut through the storm. Because of that split-second Mayday call, that one moment of fast thinking, the Coast Guard knew exactly where to look. 4 men made it out. 1 man died, all to save a 3-year cost reduction. The investigation was short. They looked at the logs Dutch had found. They looked at the rejected retrofit proposal. The verdict was simple: man-made disaster. The storm didn't sink the boat. The ice didn't sink the boat. A man looking at a spreadsheet sank the boat. Sometimes, when you are working a long shift and you see a corner getting cut because time is money, you remember the Captain Moose. You remember Cliff standing on that sinking deck, realizing his life had been traded for a line item in a ledger. You realize the scariest thing in the world isn't a monster. It is a simple calculation that says your safety is too expensive. And that is a cold, hard fact that follows you home.